The man found an alien girl with nothing, no clothes, no hope. Just a romantic story. Imagine this, a lone wanderer stumbles through an alien forest, the air thick with mystery, only to find her, a girl with no clothes, no past, just a pair of haunting amethyst eyes that hold secrets of a galaxy on the brink. Who is she? A lost soul? A weapon forged in shadow? Or the spark of something greater, something that could rewrite the stars themselves? Get ready, because this tale of survival, defiance, and a love that defies all odds is about to unfold in ways you won't see coming. Welcome to Sci-Fi Nebula, your portal to the wildest corners of the cosmos, where epic stories of humanity's future collide with the unknown. I'm your host, and together, we'll dive into tales that ignite your imagination and leave you questioning what's possible. Before we blast off, hit that like button, share this with your fellow explorers, and smash that subscribe. We're racing toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support is the fuel powering our next big adventure. Every click, every comment, lights up our galaxy of creativity, so let's make it shine brighter together. Stick with us to the end, because the real magic, the moment where a single act of kindness turns into a revolution, waits in the final frame. You won't want to miss it. So, buckle up, explorers, let's dive into the man who found an alien girl with nothing. Just a romantic story. Here we go. Chapter 1, The Wanderer and the Mystery in the Violet Woods. In the shadowed fringes of a dying galaxy, where stars bled crimson dust into the void, a lone human named Elias Voss descended onto Valtheris, an uncharted world pulsing with secrets. His mission, to map it for humanity's survival. Hers, to simply survive. The descent had been rough, the shuttle rattling as it pierced Valtheris's thick atmosphere, a violet haze swirling outside the viewport. Elias Voss, a weathered explorer-engineer of the Nova Coalition, adjusted his multifunction armor, its servos humming softly against the silence of the cockpit. At 38, he was no stranger to hostile worlds, scorched deserts, frozen tundras, gas giants spitting storms of acid, but Valtheris was different. The air shimmered with a sweetness he couldn't place, like honey distilled from alien flowers, and the forest beyond his landing site glowed with an eerie, purple luminescence. Twisted trees stretched skyward, their leaves shimmering faintly, casting dappled shadows across a carpet of moss and roots that coiled like petrified serpents. His orders were clear: survey the terrain, assess resources, report back. A routine job for a man who'd spent a decade charting the uncharted, his only companions the ghosts of a family lost to war and the cold hum of machinery. He stepped out, boots sinking into the damp earth, the forest's chorus of rustling leaves and distant chirps filling his ears. His helmet's HUD flickered, scanning for threats, none detected, yet something felt off. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. He adjusted the plasma cutter on his belt, more out of habit than necessity, and pressed deeper into the woods. That's when he saw her. She was a vision from another reality, a fragile silhouette against the glow of a bioluminescent tree. Naked, her body curled into itself among the gnarled roots, she seemed less a creature of flesh and more a sculpture carved from starlight. Her hair cascaded over her shoulders in waves of silver, glinting like fiber optics under the purple canopy. Her skin, pale with a faint violet sheen, bore the delicate scratches of a desperate escape, each mark a silent story of pain. But it was her eyes that stopped Elias cold, large, luminous, twin pools of amethyst that stared through him, not with fear, but with an emptiness so profound it clawed at his chest. She wasn't human. That much was certain. Yet something in her gaze, a flicker of lost humanity, stirred a pang he hadn't felt in years. Elias froze, his training kicking in. Alien lifeforms weren't uncommon in his line of work, but this was no beast or mindless drone. She was humanoid, vulnerable, and utterly alone. His hand hovered over his holster, then dropped. She wasn't a threat, not yet. He took a cautious step forward, the soft whir of his armor breaking the stillness. "Hey," he said, voice low and steady, the way he'd once soothed his little sister during a bombardment. "I'm not here to hurt you. Can you understand me?" She didn't move, didn't blink, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees as if shielding herself from the world. Up close, her beauty was unearthly, slender limbs, a graceful neck, the subtle curve of her hips accentuated by the way she sat. Her skin shimmered faintly, catching the tree's glow, and Elias caught himself staring longer than he intended. He shook it off, unclipping the thermal cloak from his armor, a standard-issue piece designed to withstand meteor showers and sub-zero nights. Kneeling a few feet away, he set it on the ground between them, a peace offering. "Take it," he said, nudging it closer. "You're freezing out here." For a long moment, she remained still, her gaze locked on him, searching for something, deception, perhaps, or cruelty. Then, slowly, she reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed the fabric. Elias's breath hitched as her hand grazed his glove, her skin ice-cold yet impossibly smooth, like silk spun from frost. The contact sent a jolt through him, a sensation he couldn't name, electric, primal, alive. She pulled the cloak around herself, clutching it tightly, her movements slow and deliberate, as if testing whether this act of kindness was real. "Who are you?" he asked, settling back on his heels to give her space. "What happened to you?" His voice was softer now, less a soldier's command and more a plea. She tilted her head, silver hair spilling over one shoulder, and her lips parted, but no sound came. Her eyes darted around, as if the shadows might leap out to claim her, and Elias felt a spark of anger ignite in his gut. Not at her, but at whatever, or whoever, had left her like this, stripped of everything, abandoned in a forest light years from anywhere. He stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and extended a hand. "I've got a camp not far from here. It's safe. You don't have to stay out here alone." His words hung in the air, heavy with promise. She stared at his outstretched hand, then up at his face, her amethyst eyes piercing through the dimness. Elias wondered what she saw, a scarred wanderer in dented armor, a man who'd buried his heart long ago, or something else entirely. After what felt like an eternity, she reached out, her fingers curling around his with a grip that was weak yet resolute, like a drowning soul clinging to a lifeline. The touch was fleeting, but it lingered in Elias's mind as he helped her to her feet. She swayed slightly, her bare feet unsteady on the uneven ground, and he steadied her with a hand on her arm. Her skin was still cold, but warming under his grasp, and he couldn't shake the feeling of her closeness, the faint rise and fall of her chest beneath the cloak, the way her hair brushed against his glove. "Come on," he said, guiding her forward, his voice rougher than he intended. "Let's get you somewhere warm." The trek back was slow, the forest's glow painting their path in hues of violet and shadow. Elias kept his pace measured, glancing at her every few steps. She moved with a strange grace despite her exhaustion, her silver hair swaying like a comet's tail, her form a stark contrast to the rugged bulk of his armor. He didn't know what she was, refugee, experiment, survivor, but he knew one thing, she'd been discarded, left to fade into this alien wilderness. And that stirred something in him, a quiet fury he hadn't felt since the war took everything he'd loved. As they neared the camp, a squat metallic pod nestled between two glowing trees, Elias's mind raced. The Nova Coalition would demand a report, coordinates, resources, potential threats. But this? A naked alien girl with eyes that haunted him and a story he couldn't yet unravel. This was no data point. This was a mystery, one that tugged at the edges of his carefully guarded solitude. He'd come to Valtheris looking for a foothold for humanity's future. Instead, he'd found her. Inside the pod, he activated the heating grid, the air humming with warmth as the door sealed behind them. Lyra, if that was her name, though she hadn't spoken it yet, stood near the entrance, the cloak still clutched around her like a shield. Elias gestured to a fold-out bench. "Sit. Rest. We'll figure this out." She obeyed, sinking onto the seat, her gaze never leaving him. In the pod's soft blue light, her violet-tinged skin seemed to shimmer, and Elias felt a pull he couldn't explain, not lust, not pity, but something deeper, a recognition of shared scars. He turned to his console, logging the day's findings, but his thoughts stayed on her. Who had abandoned her here? What had they done to her? And why did her presence make him feel less alone than he had in years? Outside, Valtheris whispered its secrets through the trees, but inside this small sanctuary, a different story was beginning, one of a human wanderer and an alien girl, bound by a single act of kindness in a universe that had forgotten them both. Chapter 2, Whispers from the Void. The forest of Valtheris stretched endlessly around them as Elias guided the alien girl toward his camp, the soft glow of the purple canopy casting fleeting patterns across her silver hair. The air hummed with the subtle vibrations of the planet, a chorus of rustling leaves and faint, melodic chirps from unseen creatures. Elias kept his steps measured, his armor's servos whirring quietly with each stride, but his eyes flicked to her every few moments. She moved with an eerie grace despite her obvious exhaustion, her bare feet brushing the mossy ground as if she belonged to this strange world. The thermal cloak he'd given her trailed behind her like a shadow, too large for her slender frame, and yet she clutched it tightly, her knuckles pale against the fabric. The journey was slow, her pace faltering at times, and Elias adjusted accordingly. He didn't push her, something about her fragility warned him against it. She hadn't spoken since that first tentative reach for his hand, and the silence between them felt heavy, charged with questions neither of them had yet voiced. As they approached a clearing, he gestured toward a towering tree, its bark shimmering with bioluminescent veins that pulsed like a heartbeat. "Let's rest here," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness. She nodded faintly, sinking to the ground beside the tree, her back against its glowing trunk. The light bathed her in a soft violet hue, accentuating the faint shimmer of her skin, and Elias couldn't help but notice the way it highlighted the delicate curve of her shoulders beneath the cloak. He crouched a few feet away, resting his forearms on his knees, and studied her. Up close, her alien nature was undeniable, her violet-tinged skin, the way her hair caught the light like liquid metal, but there was something else, something almost human in the way she held herself, as if clinging to a remnant of what she'd once been. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," he said, keeping his tone gentle. "But if you can, I'd like to know what happened. How you ended up out here." She didn't respond at first, her amethyst eyes fixed on the ground, tracing the tangled roots beneath her fingers. Then, suddenly, she flinched, her hands flying to her temples as a sharp gasp escaped her lips. Elias tensed, shifting closer. "Hey, you okay? What's wrong?" Her breathing quickened, shallow and ragged, and she pressed her palms harder against her head, as if trying to hold something in, or keep it out. "Pain," she whispered, her voice trembling, fragile as glass. Cold, white walls, voices without feeling, her words came in fragments, disjointed, and Elias leaned in, his hand hovering over her shoulder, hesitant to touch her but ready to steady her if she fell. "What do you see?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Her eyes widened, unfocused, staring into a void only she could perceive. "Needles, metal tables, they called me Lyra." The name slipped out like a shard of memory breaking free, and she shuddered, curling tighter into herself. Elias's jaw tightened. Lyra. It fit her somehow, ethereal, fleeting, like a note from a forgotten song. But the rest of her words sent a chill down his spine. White walls, needles, emotionless voices, he'd heard whispers of such things before, rumors passed between coalition pilots in dimly lit cantinas. The Zenith Collective, a shadowy alien organization obsessed with perfecting life through genetic manipulation, their experiments as ruthless as they were advanced. The coalition had clashed with them before, but their facilities were ghosts, hidden in the cracks of the galaxy. Lyra, he repeated softly, testing the name, letting it anchor her back to the present. "Is that what you want me to call you?" She blinked, her gaze refocusing on him, and after a moment, she nodded, a small, uncertain motion, but it carried a flicker of trust. "Okay, Lyra," he said, offering a faint smile. "I'm Elias Voss, Nova Coalition. Been wandering the stars longer than I care to admit. Lost more than I've kept." He paused, surprised at his own candor. He didn't usually talk about himself, not the war that took his family, not the years of solitude that followed, but something about her made the words spill out, as if he needed her to know he wasn't just a soldier in a suit of armor. Her fingers loosened their grip on the cloak, and she tilted her head, studying him. "Elias," she echoed, her voice a soft melody despite the strain behind it. You're alone too?" The question caught him off guard, piercing through the walls he'd built over a decade. He nodded slowly, his throat tightening. "Yeah. Guess I am." A silence settled between them, softer now, less oppressive. She reached out, her hand brushing his glove again, and this time she held on, her grip firmer than before. The coldness of her skin seeped through the fabric, but there was a warmth beneath it, faint but growing, and Elias felt his pulse quicken. "Thank you," she said, barely above a whisper, and he saw it then, a spark of hope in her eyes, fragile but real. "We should keep moving," he said, clearing his throat as he stood, helping her up. Her hand lingered in his a moment longer before she let go, and they pressed on toward the camp. The forest parted at last, revealing the squat metallic pod nestled between two glowing trees, its hull reflecting the violet light like a beacon. Elias keyed the door open, and a rush of warm air greeted them as they stepped inside. The pod was small, barely 10 feet across, with a fold-out bench, a console, and a compact storage unit, but it was a fortress compared to the wilds outside. "Sit there," he said, pointing to the bench as he powered up the heating grid. Lyra obeyed, settling onto the seat, the cloak pooling around her. Elias rummaged through the storage unit, pulling out a spare jumpsuit, gray, form-fitting, designed for long missions. "Here," he said, handing it to her. "It'll fit better than that cloak." He turned to the console, giving her privacy, but his peripheral vision betrayed him. As she slipped the cloak off, he caught a glimpse of her bare form, slender and lithe, her violet skin shimmering faintly in the pod's blue light, the curve of her hips and the graceful arc of her spine like something sculpted from a dream. He forced his eyes back to the screen, heat creeping up his neck, and busied himself logging coordinates. When he glanced back, she'd donned the jumpsuit, the fabric hugging her frame in a way that made her look both fragile and formidable, a paradox he couldn't quite grasp. She smoothed the material with her hands, then looked up at him, her silver hair spilling over one shoulder. "It's warm," she said, a hint of wonder in her voice, and Elias realized she might not have felt such comfort in a long time, maybe ever. "Good," he replied, leaning against the console. "You're safe here, Lyra. For now, at least. But I need to know more. Those white walls, the needles, what did they do to you?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the bench, and then she met his gaze, her amethyst eyes steady despite the shadows lurking within them. "They made me," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't remember how, or why. Just pain, and then here." Her words hung in the air, heavy with loss, and Elias felt that spark of anger flare again, not just at Zenith, but at the universe itself for letting someone like her suffer. He crossed the small space, sitting beside her on the bench, close enough to feel the faint heat radiating from her now warming body. "We'll figure it out," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "You're not alone anymore." She looked at him, and for the first time, a ghost of a smile touched her lips, small, fleeting, but enough to light something within him. Outside, Valtheris whispered its mysteries, but inside the pod, a fragile bond was forming, one that neither of them could yet define. Chapter 3, The First Flame Between Worlds. The interior of the pod hummed softly, a cocoon of warmth and faint blue light that stood in stark contrast to the wild, violet expanse of Valtheris outside. Elias leaned against the console, arms crossed, watching Lyra as she sat on the fold-out bench, her slender fingers tracing the seams of the gray jumpsuit he'd given her. The fabric clung to her frame, accentuating the delicate lines of her body, her narrow waist, the gentle swell of her hips, the way her legs crossed with an unconscious grace. In the pod's glow, her violet-tinged skin shimmered faintly, a reminder of her alien origins, yet the way she moved, the way she looked at him, felt achingly familiar, like a memory he couldn't place. He turned to the storage unit, pulling out a ration pack and activating the pod's food dispenser. The machine whirred, producing a small tray of nutrient paste, bland but sustaining, the kind of meal he'd eaten 1,000 times on missions. "It's not much," he said, setting it on the bench beside her, "but it'll keep you going." Lyra tilted her head, studying the grayish blob with a mix of curiosity and wariness, then scooped a bit onto her finger and tasted it. Her nose wrinkled slightly, and Elias chuckled despite himself. "Yeah, it's an acquired taste." She smiled, a real one this time, small but bright, and it lit up her face in a way that made his chest tighten. He sat beside her, keeping a careful distance, and took a bite of his own ration, the silence between them settling into something comfortable. The heat from the grid filled the pod, chasing away the chill of the forest, and for a moment, it felt almost normal, like two travelers sharing a meal after a long day, not a human soldier and an alien enigma thrown together by chance. Then, without warning, Lyra's hand flew to her temple again, her body lurching forward as a sharp gasp tore from her throat. The ration tray clattered to the floor, and Elias dropped his own, reaching for her instinctively. "Lyra, what's happening?" he asked, his voice sharp with concern. She doubled over, her silver hair spilling across her face, and he slid closer, his hands hovering over her shoulders, unsure whether to touch her. Her breathing came in shallow bursts, and when he finally rested a hand on her back, he felt the heat of her skin through the thin jumpsuit, her muscles trembling beneath his palm. They wanted something," she whispered, her voice ragged, as if the words were being ripped from her. "Something perfect, a creation, but they didn't understand." She trailed off, her eyes squeezing shut, and Elias tightened his grip, steadying her. "Didn't understand what?" he pressed, his thumb brushing the curve of her shoulder, the contact sending a faint jolt through him, warm, electric, alive. Her head snapped up, her amethyst eyes locking onto his, wide and wild with memory. "The heart," she said, her voice breaking. "The human heart, they couldn't control it, couldn't make it theirs." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The Zenith Collective, he'd heard the rumors, the whispered tales of their experiments. They didn't just manipulate genes, they sought to harness the essence of life itself, to bend it to their cold, calculating will. And Lyra, with her haunting beauty and fractured mind, was one of their creations, a living testament to their failure. She swayed, her strength giving out, and Elias caught her before she could fall, pulling her against him. Her body pressed into his, soft and warm through the jumpsuit, and he felt the rapid thud of her heartbeat against his chest, mirroring his own. Her breath brushed his neck, hot and uneven, and for a moment, he forgot where they were, forgot the pod, the forest, the mission. There was only her, fragile yet fierce, a paradox that unraveled him. "You're safe now," he murmured, his voice rougher than he intended, his hand sliding down her back, tracing the elegant line of her spine. Her skin burned under his touch, as if responding to him, and he wondered if she felt it too, the pull, the connection that defied reason. Lyra lifted her head, her face inches from his, her silver hair brushing his cheek. "You're different," she said, her voice soft but certain. "Not like them, you're warm, alive." Her hand rose, tentative at first, then pressed against his chest, her fingers splaying over the hard surface of his armor. She pushed gently, as if searching for the heartbeat beneath, and Elias felt a surge of something he couldn't name, desire, yes, but more than that, a need to protect her, to fill the void she'd been left with. He should have pulled back, kept the distance his training demanded, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned in, drawn by the gravity of her gaze, and their lips met. The kiss was slow, deliberate, a collision of tenderness and hunger. Her mouth was soft, tasting faintly of the sweet resin that lingered in Valtheris's air, and as she pressed closer, her lips parted, inviting him deeper. His hand slid to her waist, fingers curling around the curve of her hip, the jumpsuit thin enough to feel the heat of her skin beneath. She responded, her body molding against his, her breath hitching as his touch ignited something within her, a spark, a flame, a piece of herself she'd lost. When they parted, her lips were flushed, slightly swollen, and her eyes shimmered with a new light. "I feel real," she whispered, her hand still resting on his chest, as if anchoring herself to him. Elias brushed a strand of silver hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek, her skin smooth and warm under his touch. "You are real," he said, his voice low, steady. "Whatever they did to you, it doesn't change that." She nodded, a faint tremor running through her, and leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. The weight of her was light but grounding, and Elias wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. "Tell me about them," he said after a moment, his tone gentle but firm. "The Zenith Collective, what did they want with you?" Lyra's fingers tightened against his armor, and she took a shaky breath. They made me to be perfect," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stronger, faster, better, but they wanted more. They saw humans, your kind, and they were fascinated. Your emotions, your will, they couldn't replicate it, no matter how hard they tried." She paused, her eyes distant, lost in the fragments of her past. "They thought they could take it, control it, but it slipped through their hands." Elias's jaw clenched, a familiar anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He'd seen what obsession with control could do, had watched it tear worlds apart during the war, had felt it rip his own life to shreds. "They're fools," he said, his voice hard. "You can't cage something like that. It's not a formula or a gene, it's us, who we are." She looked up at him, her gaze softening, and her hand slid from his chest to his arm, her touch light but deliberate. You make me feel it," she said, her voice trembling with wonder. "What they couldn't understand, it's here, with you." Her words struck him like a blow, unraveling the walls he built around himself, and he pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. For a while, they sat there, the pods hummed the only sound, their breaths mingling in the warm air. Elias told her about his past, not all of it, not the blood and the screams, but enough, the family he'd lost, the years of drifting, the emptiness he'd carried. She listened, her hand resting in his, and when he finished, she spoke of her own void, the cold labs, the endless tests, the sense of being nothing more than a tool. Their stories wove together, threads of loss and resilience, and in the sharing, they found something new, a fragile, flickering bond that felt like defiance against the universe that had broken them. Outside, Valtheris glowed on, its secrets whispering through the trees, but inside the pod, time seemed to still. Elias didn't know what lay ahead, Zenith, the coalition, the mission, but he knew one thing, Lyra wasn't just a mystery to solve. She was a spark, a flame, and he'd be damned if he let anyone snuff it out again. Chapter 4, Under the Pressure of Shadows. The pod's interior glowed with a steady blue light, the heating grid casting a soft warmth that wrapped around Elias and Lyra like a fragile shield. They sat close on the fold-out bench, her head resting against his shoulder, her silver hair spilling over his arm. The silence between them was no longer heavy, it felt alive, woven with the echoes of their shared stories and the faint hum of the pod systems. Elias's hand rested on her back, his fingers tracing idle patterns over the jumpsuit, feeling the subtle heat of her violet-tinged skin beneath. She shifted slightly, her body pressing closer, and he caught the faint scent of her, a mix of Valtheris's sweet resin and something uniquely her own, earthy and alive. He was about to say something, maybe ask her more about Zenith, maybe just tell her she didn't have to face it alone, when a sharp chirp cut through the stillness. The console flared to life, red warning lights pulsing across the screen. Elias straightened, his hand slipping from Lyra as he moved to the controls. "Proximity alert," he muttered, scanning the data. The pod sensors had picked up movement, multiple signatures, closing in fast, their heat trails masked by some kind of advanced tech. His stomach tightened. This wasn't wildlife. This was deliberate. Lyra sat up, her amethyst eyes wide with recognition. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling but edged with steel. "The hollow enforcers. Zenith's hunters." Elias turned to her, his brow furrowing. Enforcers? She nodded, clutching the edge of the bench. They're perfect killers. No emotions, no hesitation. They never let an experiment escape. The word experiment hit Elias like a punch. That's what she was to them, a specimen, a project to be reclaimed. Anger flared in his chest, hot and fierce, but he shoved it down, focusing on the threat. How many? He asked, pulling his plasma rifle from its mount on the wall. Lyra closed her eyes, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. 10, maybe more. They're fast. He cursed under his breath, slinging the rifle over his shoulder and grabbing a spare pistol from the storage unit. Ever used one of these? He asked, holding it out to her. She hesitated, then took it, her fingers brushing his as she gripped the handle. The brief contact sent a familiar jolt through him, but he ignored it, watching as she tested the weapon's weight with a surprising ease. They trained me, she said, her voice low. In the labs, they made sure I could fight. I just never did it for myself. Elias nodded, a grim respect settling over him. Good. Stay close, we're getting out of here. He moved to the console, pulling up a schematic of the camp. I dug an emergency tunnel when I set up. Leads half a click east, to a backup transport. That's our shot. He glanced at her, expecting fear, but her jaw was set, her eyes burning with a determination that mirrored his own. Whatever Zenith had done to her, it hadn't broken her, not completely. He suited up quickly, the armor's servos locking into place with a series of clicks, and handed Lyra a lightweight vest from the storage unit. Put this on, he said, helping her adjust it over the jumpsuit. His fingers brushed her collarbone as he fastened the straps, her skin warm and smooth beneath his touch, and she looked up at him, her breath catching slightly. Thanks, she murmured, and for a moment, the danger outside faded, leaving only the two of them in the pod's dim light. The moment shattered as the first explosion rocked the camp. The pod lurched, metal groaning under the impact, and a shimmering mist seeped through the seals, a cloaking field, distorting the air with an alien glow. Elias's helmet snapped online, its HUD piercing through the haze, and he grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her toward the tunnel hatch. Now, he barked, kicking the panel open. She didn't hesitate, dropping into the narrow passage with a grace that belied her earlier fragility. He followed, sealing the hatch behind them just as a second blast shook the pod. The tunnel was tight, barely wide enough for his armored frame, and the dirt walls pressed in around them. Elias activated his suit's lights, casting a stark beam ahead, and they moved fast, Lyra leading the way with the pistol clutched in her hand. Her silver hair gleamed in the glow, and he couldn't help but notice the way her body moved, lithe and fluid, the jumpsuit hugging her curves as she navigated the uneven ground. The HUD pinged, a breach at the pod. Hollow enforcers, their signatures cold and mechanical, poured into the camp. Elias gritted his teeth, keying the pod's self-destruct sequence through his wrist. Hold up, he told Lyra, and she paused, turning to him. The explosion came seconds later, a muffled roar that sent dirt cascading from the tunnel's ceiling. It wouldn't stop the enforcers, but it'd slow them down. They pressed on, the tunnel narrowing further, forcing them closer. Lyra's shoulder brushed his chest, her breath quick and warm against his visor as they squeezed through a tight bend. You okay? He asked, his voice low. She nodded, but he saw the strain in her eyes, the memories of Zenith's labs clawing at her even now. Tell me something, he said, needing to keep her focused. Anything. About you, before this. She glanced at him, her lips parting as she considered. I remember light, she said, her voice soft but steady. Not like this, brighter, sharper. And voices, cold, telling me what to do, what to be. But I fought them, inside. Always. Her words carried a quiet defiance, and Elias felt a swell of pride he hadn't expected. Good, he said. Keep fighting. The tunnel opened into a small chamber, a concealed hatch leading to the surface. Elias climbed up first, shoving the cover aside, and pulled Lyra after him. They emerged in a clearing, the forest's violet glow muted by the pre-dawn haze. His HUD flared, 3 enforcers closing in, their crystalline armor glinting as they moved with inhuman precision. Down, he snapped, shoving Lyra behind a fallen log as a bolt of distorted energy ripped through the air. He returned fire, the plasma rifle spitting blue arcs that caught one enforcer in the chest, shattering its armor like glass. Lyra rolled out from cover, her pistol barking 3 precise shots, head, chest, leg, and a second enforcer crumpled, its form collapsing with an eerie grace. Elias stared, impressed despite the chaos. "Nice shot," he said, dropping the third with a burst to its core. More signatures appeared on the HUD, 5, then 8. "Too many," he growled, grabbing her arm. "We need to move." They sprinted toward the backup transport, hidden beneath a camouflage tarp 100 meters away. A neural disruptor blast grazed his shoulder, scrambling his armor systems for a heartbeat, and he stumbled, pain lancing through his arm. Lyra caught him, her hand strong on his waist, her body pressing against his as she steadied him. "The tunnel," she gasped, her voice fierce. "Now." They dove back into the chamber, sealing the hatch as another explosion rocked the clearing. In the dark, their bodies collided, her chest heaving against his as they caught their breath. Elias's light flickered, illuminating her face, sweat beaded on her brow, her silver hair clinging to her cheeks, her amethyst eyes blazing with resolve. "You're bleeding," he said, noticing a thin red mark on her arm where an energy bolt had grazed her, the jumpsuit torn slightly to reveal her violet skin beneath. "It's nothing," she said, but he saw the wound already closing, her alien physiology knitting itself together. "Zenith's work," she added, a bitter edge to her voice. "They made me hard to kill." "Good," Elias said, his hand resting on her shoulder, feeling the warmth of her through the torn fabric. "Because I'm not losing you to them." Outside, the enforcer's pursuit echoed closer, relentless and cold, but in that fleeting moment, with her so near, Elias felt something stronger, a fire, a promise, a defiance that no machine could extinguish. Chapter 5, Power Awakened in the Tunnel. The tunnel's darkness pressed in around Elias and Lyra, a suffocating shroud broken only by the flickering beam of his armor's light. Dust sifted from the ceiling, shaken loose by the explosions above, and the distant hum of hollow enforcers echoed through the earth, a relentless pursuit that gnawed at the edges of Elias's calm. He leaned against the dirt wall, his shoulder throbbing from the disruptor blast, his HUD flickering as the suit recalibrated. Lyra crouched beside him, her silver hair clinging to her sweat-dampened face, the torn sleeve of her jumpsuit revealing the faint shimmer of her violet skin where the wound had already sealed itself shut. Their breaths mingled in the tight space, hers quick and shallow, his steady but strained. The chamber was small, barely enough room for them to stand side by side, and their closeness was unavoidable, her shoulder pressed into his chest, the curve of her hip brushing his thigh as they steadied themselves. Elias adjusted his light, illuminating her features. Her amethyst eyes burned with a fierce resolve, her lips parted slightly, still flushed from the chaos they'd escaped. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice low, roughened by adrenaline. "They'll dig through the rubble soon enough." Lyra nodded, her hand resting on his arm, her touch light but grounding. "I know," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "But, thank you. For this, for everything." Before he could respond, she leaned in, her lips crashing into his with a desperate, searing heat. The kiss was raw, unpolished, fueled by the edge of survival, a clash of need and gratitude that caught him off guard. Her body pressed against his, soft and warm through the jumpsuit, her hands gripping his shoulders as if anchoring herself to him. He tasted the salt of her sweat, the faint sweetness of Valtheris on her lips, and his own hands moved instinctively, one sliding to her waist, the other cupping the back of her neck, fingers tangling in her silver hair. When she pulled back, her breath ragged, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his pulse race. "You've made me feel alive," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Not just a thing they created, but someone real." Elias swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking into him, unraveling the last threads of his detachment. "You were always real," he said, his thumb brushing her cheek, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath the grime. "They just couldn't see it." A faint rumble vibrated through the tunnel, a reminder of the danger closing in, and Elias forced himself to focus. "We need to move," he said, reluctantly pulling away, though his hand lingered on her arm a moment longer. She nodded, gripping the pistol he'd given her, and they climbed out of the chamber, emerging into the same clearing where they'd faced the enforcers moments before. The air was thick with the scent of scorched earth and ozone, the forest's violet glow dimmed by the smoke curling from the pod's wreckage. His HUD pinged, more enforcers, their crystalline forms glinting as they burst through the trees, weapons raised. Elias shoved Lyra behind a fallen log, firing a burst from his plasma rifle that shattered one hunter's chest plate. But there were too many, 6 now, their movements synchronized, cold, and precise. "We can't outrun them," he growled, reloading as another bolt sizzled past his head. Lyra's hand tightened on his arm, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Then we fight," she said, her tone fierce, unshakable. "Together, or not at all." She stepped out from cover before he could stop her, her pistol raised, and Elias saw something shift in her, a spark igniting into a flame. Her body moved like liquid starlight, faster than he'd thought possible, her shots finding their marks with deadly accuracy. One enforcer fell, then another, their crystalline armor cracking under her fire. Elias joined her, laying down suppressing shots, but it was Lyra who stole his breath. Her violet skin began to shimmer, a faint glow radiating from her as she dodged an energy bolt with inhuman grace. She leaped, closing the distance to a third enforcer, and drove her fist into its chest, her strength amplified beyond anything human, the impact shattering its core. The hunter collapsed, and she turned to him, her eyes blazing with an inner fire, her hair whipping around her like a halo of silver flame. "They made me this," she called out, her voice ringing with defiance as she took down another. "But you gave me this." She gestured to herself, not just her body, but the will driving it, the passion fueling her every move. Elias grinned despite the odds, dropping a 5th enforcer with a precise shot to its head. "Damn right," he shouted back. "They don't know what they unleashed." The last enforcer lunged, its weapon spitting a bolt that grazed Lyra's side, tearing a gash in her jumpsuit and leaving a red welt on her skin. She stumbled, and Elias roared, charging forward to finish it with a burst that turned its crystalline form to shards. The clearing fell silent, the only sound their heavy breathing and the distant rustle of Valtheris's trees. He rushed to her, dropping to his knees beside her as she leaned against the log, clutching her side. "You hurt?" he asked, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch but needing to know. She shook her head, the wound already closing, though her face was pale with exertion. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice softer now, vulnerable. Then she looked up at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Are you afraid of me now? After this?" Elias stared at her, her glowing skin, her blood-streaked jumpsuit, the power she'd just unleashed, and shook his head. "Afraid?" He reached out, pulling her into his arms, his hands firm on her back, feeling the heat of her through the torn fabric. "They didn't make you, Lyra. They tried to forge a weapon, but you chose to be more. That's what I see." Her breath hitched, and she melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body trembling not from fear but from relief. Their lips met again, this time slower, deeper, a kiss born of triumph and raw connection. Her skin was hot against his, her fingers digging into his armor as if she could pull him closer still, and he felt her heartbeat racing beneath his palms, a rhythm that matched his own. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his, her silver hair falling around them like a curtain. "We should go," she murmured, her voice husky, though her body stayed pressed to his, reluctant to break the moment. "Yeah," Elias agreed, his hand sliding to the small of her back, tracing the curve there before helping her up. "But we're not running forever." He led her toward the backup transport, a sleek, camouflaged craft hidden beneath a tarp. As he powered it up, Lyra stood beside him, her gaze distant, thoughtful. "There are others," she said suddenly, her voice firm. "Like me, experiments, hybrids, lost out there. They deserve to know they can be more than what Zenith made them." Elias paused, turning to her, and saw the resolve in her eyes, a purpose taking root. "You want to find them," he said, not a question but a realization. She nodded, her hand resting on his arm, her touch warm and steady. "And I want you with me," she added, softer now, almost a plea. "You've shown me what it means to fight for something, for someone." He covered her hand with his, feeling the strength in her slender fingers, and nodded. "Then we'll find them together," he said, his voice rough with conviction. "Zenith doesn't get to win this one." The transport hummed to life, its engines purring as they climbed aboard, and Elias set a course away from the clearing, away from the wreckage of the pod and the shattered enforcers. Lyra settled beside him, her shoulder brushing his, and in the dim light of the cockpit, her violet skin glowed faintly, a beacon of defiance, of hope, of something neither of them had expected to find. As Valtheris shrank behind them, Elias glanced at her, her profile sharp against the viewport, and felt a certainty settle over him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about her, about them, and a fight that was only beginning. Chapter 6, The Revolution of Feeling. The transport hummed through Valtheris's violet skies, its stealth systems cloaking their escape as Elias piloted away from the smoldering clearing. Lyra sat beside him in the cramped cockpit, her silver hair catching the faint glow of the controls, her violet-tinged skin still shimmering from the battle's aftermath. Her jumpsuit was torn at the side, revealing a sliver of her waist where the wound had healed, and Elias's hand rested on the console near hers, their fingers brushing, a quiet tether in the storm they'd just survived. Outside, the forest blurred into streaks of purple and shadow, but inside, the air crackled with something new, purpose. They'd barely cleared the atmosphere when the transport sensors blared, a massive signature dropping out of hyperspace, its crystalline silhouette dominating the viewport. Elias tensed, recognizing the design, a Zenith Collective command ship, its angular hull pulsing with an otherworldly light. "They're not done with us," he muttered, his hand tightening on the controls. Lyra leaned forward, her amethyst eyes narrowing. "The High Council," she said, her voice steady but laced with an ancient fear. "They've come themselves." The comms crackled, projecting a holographic triad of figures into the cockpit, Zenith leaders, their forms geometric and flawless, faces devoid of warmth. Subject Lyra, the central figure intoned, its voice a precise monotone, "Your performance exceeds all projections. The human's influence has produced anomalies we must analyze." Elias bristled, his free hand dropping to his pistol, but Lyra's touch on his wrist stopped him, a spark of warmth that steadied his rage. "I'm not your subject," she declared, rising from her seat, her voice ringing with authority. "And what you call anomalies, you'll never grasp." The council tilted their heads in unison, a flicker of confusion breaking their perfect composure. "Explain," the second figure demanded, its tone sharpening. "Our data shows human emotion reduces efficiency by 47.3%. Yet your capabilities have surpassed our highest models." Lyra laughed, a sound rich with defiance and joy, and stepped closer to Elias, her body brushing his with deliberate intent. "You're trying to measure what can't be measured," she said, her hand sliding to his shoulder, fingers pressing into his armor. "Human emotion isn't a flaw, it's a force." She turned to him, her eyes softening, and whispered, "Show them." He didn't hesitate. Pulling her into his arms, he kissed her, a deep, unrestrained surge of passion that drowned out the council's sterile presence. Her lips were hot against his, tasting of sweat and sweet resin, and she melted into him, her hands gripping his neck, her body pressing so close he felt every curve through the torn jumpsuit. Her violet skin flared, a radiant glow filling the cockpit, and the energy between them pulsed like a living thing, wild, untamed, defying every calculation Zenith had ever made. The council's holograms flickered, their instruments overloading as the readings spiked. "Impossible," One muttered, its voice cracking with disbelief. The energy signatures, they defy all parameters. Lyra broke the kiss, her breath ragged, her glow illuminating Elias's face as she turned to them. This is what you'll never have, she said, her voice fierce. Not through your labs, not through your control, only through choice, through feeling, through love. The central figure's composure faltered, its crystalline features twitching. This power, it cannot exist uncontrolled, it said, but doubt seeped into its words. Elias tightened his grip on Lyra's waist, feeling her heat through his gloves, and spoke up. That's where you're wrong, he said, his voice rough with conviction. Real strength doesn't come from control, it comes from this. He pressed his hand over her heart, her pulse racing beneath his palm, and she smiled, a radiant, mischievous curve that lit up the dark. Before the council could respond, the sensors blared again, multiple signatures, this time friendly. Nova Coalition ships dropped out of hyperspace, their sleek hulls a stark contrast to Zenith's crystalline menace. Cavalry's here, Elias said, a grin tugging at his lips. The council exchanged glances, their perfect symmetry fracturing, and the command ship's engines flared as it retreated, vanishing into the void. Lyra leaned against him, her breath warm on his neck. They'll be back, she murmured. They're obsessed now, desperate to understand us. Let them try, Elias replied, his hand sliding to the small of her back, tracing the curve there. Some things can't be dissected. The transport stabilized, aligning with the Nova fleet, and for a moment, they simply held each other, the hum of the engines a quiet backdrop to their shared triumph. 6 months later, Elias and Lyra stood on the observation deck of the Nova Coalition's diplomatic station, New Dawn, orbiting a neutral system. Below, an unprecedented sight unfolded, Zenith ships docking alongside human vessels, their once uniform hulls now etched with subtle, organic patterns, each unique, each alive with variation. Lyra pressed against the viewport, her jumpsuit replaced by a sleek Coalition uniform tailored to her frame, her violet skin glowing faintly in the starlight. They're changing, she said, her voice soft with wonder. That day, our connection, it started something they couldn't stop. Elias wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands resting on her hips, feeling the familiar surge of warmth where their bodies met. A revolution of feeling, he agreed, his breath stirring her silver hair. Who'd have thought finding you in that forest would turn an entire civilization upside down? She turned in his embrace, her amethyst eyes sparkling with mischief and love, and pressed herself closer, her curves fitting perfectly against him. Are you complaining? She teased, her fingers tracing the edge of his jaw. Not a chance, he said, grinning as he pulled her in, his hands sliding up her back, savoring the heat of her skin through the fabric. Their lips met, slow and deep, and her glow intensified, a visible pulse of energy that danced across the deck. Beyond the viewport, the Zenith ships continued their transformation, crystalline edges softening, patterns shifting with the emotions awakening in their crews. Reports had flooded in over the months, Zenith beings seeking human contact, their perfect society fracturing into something beautifully imperfect as they rediscovered joy, curiosity, desire. They're calling it the Great Awakening, Lyra said when they parted, her voice husky, her hands still resting on his chest. All because you chose kindness over fear that day. Elias brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. And you chose to fight, he said. To feel. That's what they couldn't predict. She smiled, pressing herself closer, and the energy field around them shimmered, a testament to their bond, a fusion of human passion and Zenith engineering that defied every law the collective had clung to. There's more to do, she said, her tone firm with purpose. Others out there, experiments like me, they need to know they're not alone. Elias nodded, his hand finding hers, their fingers intertwining. Then we'll find them, he promised. Together. The station's lights dimmed as the viewport tinted, framing them against the stars, their silhouettes a single, unbroken line. What had begun with a naked alien girl in a forest, stripped of hope, had become a beacon, a revolution that rippled across the galaxy, proving that love, not control, was the truest power of all. Elias held her tight, her warmth a constant against the cold of space, and knew their story was far from over. It was just beginning, a journey to reclaim the lost, to rewrite the stars with the strength of their hearts. And as the Zenith ships danced below, awakening to a new existence, Elias whispered against her lips, "From ashes to hope, huh?" Lyra laughed, her glow flaring bright, and kissed him again, a promise, a spark, a future unbound. And there you have it, a journey from the violet shadows of Valtheris to a revolution that shook the stars, all sparked by a man named Elias and an alien girl called Lyra, whose bond proved that love and defiance can outshine even the coldest control. If this tale of heart, hope, and cosmic awakening lit a spark in you, don't forget to drop a like and hit subscribe to keep the sci-fi nebula glowing strong. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, suggest a topic you'd like us to explore next, or simply drop a 1 if this story captivated you, or a 0 if we've got room to soar higher. Your support is the gravity that keeps us orbiting, so thank you, explorers, for joining us. Until our next adventure, stay curious, and we'll see you among the stars.